Welcome to Equanimity. In this video, we summarize the Alan Watts book, The Watercourse Way, as it explores and contemplates various philosophical perspectives from his lifelong journey. There are some great teachings in here, so feel free to pause and contemplate various aspects. The video is divided into 5 parts. Part 1, The Illusion of Control and the Forgotten Intelligence of Life. Part 2, Why Effortless Action and the Paradox of Non-Forcing. Part 3, Order Without Control, Society, Power, and the Limits of Design. Part 4, The Self as a Process, Identity, Ego, and the Flow of Awareness. Part 5, Living the Watercourse Way, Meaning, Mortality, and Trusting the Flow. There is a link in the description if you would like to read the book yourself. Enjoy. Modern life trains us to believe that reality must be managed, controlled, corrected, and improved through constant effort. From early childhood, we are taught that success comes from striving, discipline, force of will, and the careful manipulation of circumstances. We learn to see life as a problem to be solved rather than a process to be lived. This assumption sits so deeply in our thinking that it often goes unnoticed. Yet it is precisely this assumption that the Watercourse Way quietly challenges from the very beginning. The central question underlying the book is simple but unsettling. What if the universe does not need to be controlled at all? What if life already knows how to function, grow, and balance itself when we stop interfering in harmful ways? Rather than presenting this as a mystical belief, the book approaches it as a practical observation drawn from nature, psychology, and ancient philosophy. The Taoist tradition, which the book draws from, does not see the universe as a machine that must be engineered, but as a living process that unfolds according to its own intelligence. This intelligence is not personal or moral in the human sense. It does not reward effort or punish failure. It simply works. The seasons turn, rivers flow, forests grow, and ecosystems regulate themselves without supervision. The idea that humans must stand outside this process and force it into order is a relatively recent development in human thinking. One of the most important insights introduced early in the book is that the feeling of being separate from the world is largely an illusion created by language and thought. We talk as though there is me on one side and the world on the other. We imagine ourselves as controllers standing apart from reality, trying to shape it according to our plans. But when we look closely, this separation collapses. Our bodies are not outside nature, they are made of it. Our thoughts are not floating above reality, they arise from biological processes shaped by the same forces that shape rivers and stars. This sense of separation creates tension. When we believe we are isolated agents responsible for managing life, every mistake feels personal and every uncertainty becomes a threat. Anxiety grows from the belief that if we do not constantly intervene, things will fall apart. The book suggests that much of human suffering comes not from reality itself, but from this false sense of opposition between the self and the world. The Taoist response to this tension is not withdrawal or passivity, but a different way of participating in life. This way is symbolized by water. Water does not struggle against obstacles, it flows around them. It does not compete for dominance, yet over time it shapes landscapes more powerfully than force ever could. Water adapts without losing its nature. It responds without resistance. This is not weakness, it is intelligence expressed through flexibility. In contrast, human beings often attempt to live like rigid structures rather than flowing processes. We cling to fixed identities, fixed goals, fixed moral rules, and fixed ideas of success. When life inevitably changes, we experience frustration and fear because our inner rigidity cannot adapt quickly enough. The book points out that rigidity is what breaks while flexibility survives. A major theme introduced in this section is the misunderstanding of effort. In Western thinking, effort is often treated as an unquestioned virtue. We assume that more effort automatically leads to better results. Taoism challenges this assumption by observing that there is a point at which effort becomes interference. A gardener does not pull on a plant to make it grow faster. A swimmer does not fight the water in order to stay afloat. In many areas of life, forcing outcomes creates resistance that slows progress or produces unintended consequences. This does not mean doing nothing. It means learning the difference between natural action and forced action. Natural action arises from understanding the situation clearly and responding appropriately. Forced action arises from fear, ego, or impatience. The book emphasizes that the most effective actions often feel effortless, not because nothing is happening, but because the action is aligned with the situation rather than imposed upon it. Another important idea introduced here is that moral rigidity can be just as harmful as physical force. When societies impose strict moral categories of right and wrong without sensitivity to context, they often create hypocrisy, rebellion, and suffering. Taoism does not reject ethics, but it distrusts absolute rules that ignore the complexity of life. What works in one situation may be harmful in another. Wisdom lies in responsiveness, not rigid judgment. The book also challenges the belief that consciousness is something trapped inside the human skull. Instead, it suggests that awareness is a function of the entire organism interacting with its environment. Just as a whirlpool is not a thing separate from the river, the human self is not separate from the world in which it arises. This perspective softens the fear of loss and death because it reframes the individual not as an isolated object, but as a temporary pattern within a larger flow. By the end of this first part, the reader is gently but firmly invited to reconsider some deeply held assumptions: that control equals safety, that effort equals virtue, that separation equals identity. Rather than offering instructions or rules, the book begins by loosening certainty. It invites curiosity instead of belief. The core message is not that we must adopt Taoism as a philosophy, but that we might benefit from observing how life already functions when left to itself. This sets the foundation for the rest of the work, which gradually explores how this understanding applies to society, psychology, spirituality, and everyday life. Always returning to the central metaphor of water: yielding, adaptive, powerful without force, and deeply aligned with the natural order of things. One of the most misunderstood ideas in Taoist philosophy is wu-wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action. At first glance, the term sounds like an instruction to do nothing, to withdraw from responsibility, or to drift passively through life. This misunderstanding has caused many people to dismiss Taoism as impractical or escapist. The Watercourse way makes clear that wu-wei is not about inactivity at all. It is about acting without strain, without ego, and without forcing outcomes. Wu-wei refers to action that flows naturally from the situation itself. It is what happens when understanding replaces anxiety and clarity replaces compulsion. When a skilled musician plays effortlessly, they are not doing nothing, they are fully engaged, yet their effort does not feel strained. Their body and awareness move together without internal conflict. Wu-wei describes this quality of action, not its absence. The book contrasts this with the kind of action most people are familiar with: action driven by fear of failure, hunger for control, or attachment to results. This kind of effort feels tense. It requires constant self-monitoring, second-guessing, and comparison. It often creates resistance, both internally and externally. Wu-wei, by contrast, arises when the mind stops trying to dominate the process and instead cooperates with it. A central paradox explored in this section is that trying too hard often prevents the very outcome we desire. This can be seen in countless everyday situations. When you are trying to fall asleep, effort keeps you awake. When you are trying to appear confident, self-consciousness undermines confidence. When you are trying to be spontaneous, planning ruins spontaneity. The harder the ego pushes, the more the process resists. The book emphasizes that this is not a psychological trick, but a structural feature of how life works. Many processes are self-regulating. Interfering with them introduces noise and imbalance. Breathing is a perfect example. You can influence it, but you cannot control it in the same way you control a machine. If you try to dominate breathing completely, it becomes labored. If you trust it, it regulates itself smoothly. Wu-wei does not mean abandoning intention. It means releasing the illusion that intention must be enforced through tension. In Taoism, intention is like steering a boat downstream rather than paddling upstream. You still choose direction, but you respect the current. When you work with the flow of circumstances rather than against them, effort becomes economical and effective. This idea challenges deeply ingrained cultural habits. Many societies reward visible struggle. We praise exhaustion, busyness, and sacrifice, often confusing them with dedication. The book points out that this obsession with strain leads to burnout, conflict, and diminishing returns. It also leads to a distorted moral framework where people feel guilty for ease and suspicious of simplicity. Wu-wei invites a re-evaluation of what competence actually looks like. True skill often appears relaxed. A master craftsperson does not rush or hesitate. Their movements are precise because they are unforced. Similarly, a wise leader does not micromanage. They create conditions in which order emerges naturally. Excessive control signals a lack of trust both in others and in the process itself. Another important theme in this section is timing. Wu-wei is closely connected to sensitivity to timing. Forcing an action too early or too late creates friction. Nature operates through rhythms: day and night, seasons, growth, and decay. Human systems also have rhythms, though they are often ignored. Acting in harmony with timing requires patience and attentiveness rather than urgency. The book illustrates how impatience is often disguised as productivity. We rush decisions to relieve anxiety, not because action is truly required. Wu-wei encourages waiting when waiting is appropriate and acting decisively when the moment is ripe. This kind of patience is not passive. It is alert and ready. A particularly striking insight here is that ego is the main obstacle to Wu Wei. Ego insists on taking credit, proving worth, and securing outcomes. It fears uncertainty and resists ambiguity. Wu Wei dissolves the need for constant self-assertion. Action no longer needs to be justified by applause or validation. It simply happens because it fits the situation. This does not mean the disappearance of individuality. Rather, individuality is expressed more fully when it is not constrained by self-conscious performance. Just as water takes the shape of the riverbed without losing its nature, a person practicing Wu Wei adapts without becoming formless or submissive. The book also addresses a common concern: does Wu Wei lead to moral irresponsibility? The answer offered is subtle. Taoism does not impose rigid moral commandments, but it does not deny ethics. Instead, it suggests that ethical behavior arises naturally from clarity and connection. When people feel separate and defensive, they act selfishly. When they experience themselves as part of a larger whole, cooperation becomes obvious rather than forced. Wu Wei therefore has social implications. Systems built on excessive regulation often produce resistance and corruption. Systems that allow flexibility and trust tend to self-correct more effectively. This does not mean eliminating structure, but designing it in a way that supports natural behavior rather than suppressing it. By the end of this section, Wu Wei emerges not as a mysterious Eastern concept, but as a practical principle observable in daily life. It appears wherever skill, ease, and intelligence converge. It is present in art, athletics, relationships, and leadership. It cannot be manufactured through effort alone. It arises when effort relaxes into understanding. This sets the stage for the next part, where the book explores how this principle applies to society, politics, and human attempts to impose order on complex systems, often with unintended consequences. Human societies are built on a shared belief that order must be imposed from the outside. Laws, institutions, hierarchies, and rules are designed to prevent chaos, coordinate behavior, and maintain stability. While some degree of structure is clearly necessary, the Watercourse way questions a deeper assumption beneath these systems: the belief that order can only exist through control. This section explores how attempts to over-control society often generate the very disorder they are meant to prevent. Taoist thought approaches social order in the same way it approaches nature, as something that emerges organically when conditions are right. Just as ecosystems regulate themselves through interdependence, human communities also have self-organizing tendencies. When people are trusted, informed, and allowed flexibility, cooperation often arises naturally. When people are constrained by excessive rules and surveillance, creativity declines and resistance grows. The book does not argue for the absence of governance, but for humility in governance. It highlights the danger of leaders who believe they can fully understand and manage complex systems. Societies are not machines with predictable outputs. They are living processes shaped by countless interacting variables. When centralized power attempts to control every outcome, it creates unintended consequences that require even more control to fix, resulting in a feedback loop of regulation and resistance. One of the key ideas here is that order enforced through fear is inherently unstable. When compliance is achieved through punishment or coercion, people obey only as long as they are watched. Remove the threat and behavior collapses. By contrast, order that arises from shared understanding and mutual benefit is resilient. It continues even in the absence of enforcement because it aligns with people's own interests and values. This leads to a critique of moral absolutism in politics and law. When leaders divide the world into rigid categories of good and evil, right and wrong, loyal and disloyal, they simplify reality in order to manage it. But life resists simplification. Policies designed without sensitivity to context often fail because they treat people as abstractions rather than living beings. Taoism favors adaptability over ideology, observation over assumption. The book uses the metaphor of water again to illustrate effective leadership. Water does not command, it supports. It nourishes without demanding recognition. A wise leader in this view does not dominate or micromanage. They create conditions in which people can function well on their own. When leadership is effective, it becomes almost invisible. People feel guided but not controlled. A significant portion of this section examines how power corrupts when it becomes self-justifying. When institutions exist primarily to preserve themselves, they lose touch with the realities they were created to serve. Rules multiply not because they improve life, but because they reinforce authority. This creates distance between decision makers and those affected by their decisions, increasing misunderstanding and resentment. Taoism does not propose replacing one system with another. Instead, it questions the mindset that believes perfection can be engineered through planning alone. Human history is filled with examples of idealistic systems that collapsed because they ignored human complexity. The book suggests that wisdom lies not in grand designs, but in continuous adjustment, guided by feedback rather than ideology. Another important theme is the role of trust. Trust is not naive optimism, it is recognition of interdependence. When systems assume people are fundamentally untrustworthy, they design structures that encourage dishonesty and avoidance. When systems assume basic goodwill, they encourage responsibility. Trust, once broken by excessive control, is difficult to rebuild. The book also explores how social conflict often arises from identity rigidity. When people are forced into fixed roles, citizen versus outsider, productive versus useless, moral versus immoral, they begin to defend those identities aggressively. Taoism dissolves rigid identity by emphasizing process over position. People are not static labels, they are changing patterns within a larger whole. This perspective reframes social harmony as balance rather than uniformity. Differences are not threats to order, they are sources of resilience. Just as an ecosystem depends on diversity, societies thrive when multiple perspectives coexist. Attempts to eliminate difference in the name of order often weaken the system as a whole. The section also touches on economics, noting that excessive intervention can distort natural feedback loops. When systems are shielded from consequences, inefficiency accumulates. Taoism does not glorify markets or nature as perfect, but it respects feedback as a teacher. Interference that prevents learning creates fragility. Throughout this part, the book emphasizes limits of knowledge, limits of control, limits of prediction. Recognizing limits is not defeat, it is maturity. When leaders accept that they cannot foresee every outcome, they design systems that can adapt. When they deny limits, they create brittle structures that collapse under stress. By the end of Part 3, the reader is invited to reconsider what good governance really means. It may not be about tighter control, more rules, or stronger enforcement. It may be about clarity, humility, responsiveness, and trust in the natural intelligence of human systems. This prepares the ground for the next section, which turns inward, examining how these same principles apply not just to society, but to the individual psyche, identity, and the experience of self. One of the most profound shifts encouraged in the Watercourse way is a re-examination of what we mean by the self. Most people grow up assuming that the self is a fixed entity, a thinker inside the head, a controller behind the eyes, a decision-maker standing apart from the world. This assumption feels so natural that it rarely gets questioned. Yet Taoist philosophy suggests that this image of the self is not only inaccurate, but a major source of psychological tension. Rather than viewing the self as a solid thing, the book presents it as a process, much like a flame or a wave. A flame appears stable, but it exists only as long as fuel, oxygen, and heat interact. A wave has a recognizable shape, yet it is nothing separate from the movement of water. In the same way, the human self is a pattern of sensations, thoughts, memories, and responses arising within a larger flow of life. This perspective dissolves the sharp boundary between me and the world. Breathing happens in response to the air, thinking happens in response to experience. Emotions arise from relationships and circumstances. There is no isolated controller standing outside these processes. The sense of control emerges within the process, not above it. The book explains that ego is not an enemy, but a misunderstanding. Ego is simply the habit of identifying with certain patterns, a name, a story, a role, and treating them as permanent. Once this identification becomes rigid, fear follows. Anything that threatens the story feels like a threat to survival. Much of anxiety, defensiveness, and aggression arises from protecting an image rather than responding to reality. From the Taoist viewpoint, the problem is not that we have identities, but that we cling to them. We mistake labels for reality. We say, I am this kind of person, or this is who I must be, and then struggle when life asks us to change. Water does not cling to a single shape. It becomes a river, a cloud, rain, or ice without confusion. Human suffering increases when flexibility is replaced by fixation. This section also addresses self-consciousness, the constant monitoring of oneself from an imagined external viewpoint. While some self-reflection is useful, excessive self-consciousness fragments experience. Instead of being present, attention splits between doing and judging. The book suggests that this internal division weakens spontaneity and joy. When awareness flows without constant commentary, action becomes more natural and effective. A key insight here is that trying to control the mind creates mental noise. Thoughts, like ripples in water, respond to attention. The more one tries to suppress or manipulate them, the more they multiply. This is why forced positive thinking often backfires. Wu Wei applied to the mind means allowing thoughts to arise and pass without interference. Clarity comes not from stopping thought, but from not being trapped by it. The book draws a clear distinction between awareness and thought. Awareness is the open field in which thoughts appear. When identity shifts from the content of thought to the space of awareness, psychological rigidity softens. Problems are still addressed, but they no longer define the self. This shift reduces suffering without requiring belief in anything supernatural. Another theme explored is the fear of losing oneself. Many people resist this perspective because they believe that without a fixed ego, responsibility and meaning disappear. The book counters this by pointing out that responsibility does not require rigidity. In fact, responsiveness improves when identity is fluid. When you are not defending a self-image, you can listen more deeply, admit mistakes, and adjust course without shame. This view also reframes creativity. Creativity does not come from forcing originality, but from allowing ideas to arise through openness. Artists, writers, and thinkers often report that their best work feels as though it happens through them rather than by them. Taoism treats this not as mysticism, but as a natural result of non-resistance. The book further explores emotional life through this lens. Emotions are not problems to be fixed, but signals to be felt. When emotions are resisted or labeled as unacceptable, they persist. When they are allowed to move through awareness, they change naturally. Like weather patterns, emotions pass when not clung to. This does not mean indulging every impulse, but acknowledging experience without repression. This understanding has implications for mental health. Much distress comes from fighting internal states, trying to eliminate fear, control sadness, or manufacture happiness. Taoism suggests that peace arises from allowing experience to be as it is while responding intelligently. Acceptance is not resignation, it is clarity. As this part comes to a close, the reader is invited to see themselves not as a problem to be solved, but as a living process unfolding within a larger whole. When identity relaxes, life feels less like a battle and more like a conversation. Action becomes responsive rather than defensive. This prepares the final section, which addresses the ultimate questions often left unspoken: mortality, meaning, and how living the Watercourse way reshapes our relationship with life and death itself. The final movement of the Watercourse way brings all previous themes together and applies them to the most deeply human concerns: meaning, uncertainty, and death. Rather than offering comforting beliefs or fixed answers, the Taoist approach reframes these concerns entirely. The book suggests that much of our existential anxiety comes from misunderstanding our relationship to life. Specifically, from believing that life is something we possess rather than something we participate in. Modern culture often treats life as a personal project with a beginning, a narrative arc, and an end that must be justified. Meaning becomes something to be manufactured, accumulated, or proven. When meaning is treated this way, it easily collapses under pressure. Failure, aging, or loss begin to feel like threats to existence itself. The Taoist view dissolves this pressure by shifting focus from outcomes to participation in the process. From this perspective, meaning is not imposed from above or achieved at the end of a journey. It is inherent in engagement. Just as music does not exist in the final note but in the playing, life's meaning is found in the living. When attention is anchored in outcomes, experience is constantly postponed. When attention returns to the present process, fulfillment becomes available immediately. The book returns again to the metaphor of water to illustrate mortality. Water does not fear changing form. It becomes vapor, rain, ice, and river without loss of essence. Human fear of death arises largely from identifying with a static image of the self. When the self is understood as a process rather than a thing, death is no longer annihilation of an object, but transformation within a larger flow. This does not deny grief or loss. Taoism does not minimize the emotional reality of death. What it questions is the added suffering created by imagining death as an ultimate failure or injustice. Nature does not mourn the falling of leaves as a mistake. Decay and renewal are part of the same movement. When humans resist this truth, they experience isolation from the very system that sustains them. Another theme emphasized here is trust, not blind faith, but experiential trust in life's self-regulating intelligence. Trust develops not through belief, but through observation. When people experiment with letting go of unnecessary control, they often discover that things continue to function, sometimes better than before. Relationships deepen, creativity increases, and anxiety loosens its grip. The book also addresses the common fear that surrender leads to passivity or loss of ambition. In reality, the opposite often occurs. When action is no longer driven by fear of inadequacy or obsession with results, energy becomes available for meaningful engagement. Goals still exist, but they are approached with flexibility. Success and failure lose their moral weight and become feedback rather than verdicts. Living the Watercourse way also reshapes how one approaches suffering. Pain is not denied, but resistance to pain is recognized as optional. Much suffering comes from mental commentary layered on top of experience, stories about unfairness, permanence, and personal failure. When these stories loosen, pain becomes more manageable. It moves through rather than stagnates. The book encourages simplicity not as an aesthetic choice but as a psychological one. Complexity multiplies when we attempt to control too much. Simplicity arises when we focus on what actually matters in each moment. This is not minimalism as a lifestyle trend but attentiveness as a way of being. Toward the end, the book suggests that wisdom is not accumulation of knowledge, but reduction of interference. Children, animals, and skilled practitioners often embody wu-wei naturally. Over time, social conditioning obscures this ability. The Watercourse way is less about learning something new and more about unlearning unnecessary habits of tension. There is also a quiet ethical implication here. When people experience themselves as part of a larger whole, compassion becomes practical rather than idealistic. Harm to others feels less separate from harm to oneself. This is not enforced through moral rules but felt through connection. Ethics arise from awareness rather than obligation. The final message of the book is neither dramatic nor prescriptive. It does not demand conversion or discipline. It simply invites a shift in perspective, from forcing to flowing, from defending to responding, from controlling to cooperating. Life, it suggests, is not a puzzle to be solved but a movement to be joined. Living the Watercourse way does not guarantee comfort or certainty. What it offers instead is ease without avoidance, engagement without exhaustion, and meaning without strain. It is a way of trusting that the same intelligence that moves rivers and seasons is also at work in human lives if we allow it. With this, the book closes not with an answer but with an opening. The invitation is not to believe, but to notice, to observe where effort creates friction, where control breeds resistance, and where letting go allows things to fall into place on their own. Thanks for listening. Leave a comment of your favorite Alan Watts book and slash or perspective.